Stuart Holbrook has spent his life in the world of collectors. As president of Theriaults, the world's leader in the auction of antique dolls and figurative art for over 30 years, he's managed the often personal and always wild world of collecting and collectors. His market expertise and knowledge of trends comes to life in The Curious Collector, where he shares his experience and experiences in real-life stories, alongside sage advice on how to build great collections within the happy life of a collector.
Well, greetings again, everybody, for a new episode on The Curious Collector. I'm keeping you updated on my travels around the country for Table Talk Doll Club Tour 2025, meeting with doll clubs and doll collectors all over the United States. Each week in these episodes, I'm giving you kind of an update of where I am before I launch into my long description of something new, a subject we can all get into and have fun with. Right now, I've just landed and checked into my hotel in Lake Worth, Florida, and we'll be meeting with the Doll Club there tomorrow, and then heading up to Ocala, Florida, and meeting with another one, and then flying back and moving on from there. I think we're up to 62 clubs now. They keep coming in more and more every week as they're hearing all the chatter about this. So it has been really, really incredible as I've been telling everybody about it, and some of the people that I'm meeting, fantastic collectors. I even got a wonderful venue the other day in Findlay, Ohio. There is a museum I had never heard of. I'm calling it the greatest museum you've probably never heard of. It's called the Mazza Museum. And if you go to my Facebook page, Stuart Holbrook Theriaults, my personal Facebook area, you will see a description of this. And if you're ever driving on I-75 between Toledo and Cincinnati, you've got to stop there. It is incredible. It's an entire museum dedicated to the artwork original artwork of children's literature over the years, including my favorite. They even have a whole exhibit and special gallery of pop-up books, which was really fun. So these are all the adventures I get as I travel around to do these Doll Club meetings, and it's been amazing and a lot more to go. So let's get into it and talk about Love, Shirley Temple. 10 years later. I can't believe it. 10 years since that day, and I can still see almost every moment of that year of my life, that I called it, that train that Shirley took me on, that ride that was the most incredible ride of my career, in presenting all of her memorabilia and childhood objects and dolls, everything from her youth. And I mean, it's not just any youth. This is Shirley Temple, one of the most iconic figures of the 20th century. And I think we can pretty safely say the most iconic childhood of the 20th century, and a legend. She gave a country hope when it had none. She gave us laughter and dancing and songs and cheer when a nation needed it most. And she brought to me one of the greatest joys of my working career and one of the greatest joys of my personal life, you could even say, because it all intersects over time, in being able to work on this project. And the journey and the people and the stories that came from it are ones that I will be telling for the rest of my life. And talking about my doll club tours and thinking about these 10 years, it really shows what that moment gave to us, in that I'm meeting a lot of the Shirley Temple collectors, or even people who weren't collectors that became collectors, that were inspired by that auction and that moment, and still talk about it as the greatest event that they ever attended, and something that will live as one of the greatest memories of their life, of being at that auction event and all the exhibits we did around the country. So I'm going to kind of take you through some of the memories of that year and some of the incredible experiences and people I met along the way. This is, in a lot of ways, very emotional, because I'm thinking about it now and I'm realizing how kind of melancholy I am about it, and how beautiful these memories are. And it almost makes me emotional inside, because it was incredible. I sang with people, I cried with people, I laughed with people, and I had this experience that will, as I said, live with me forever. So how did it all start? Believe it or not, on my birthday, on December 29th, 2014, I have an email sitting in my inbox from Charles Black Jr., the son of Shirley Temple, saying that he would like to have a chance to speak with me about his mother's doll collection, who he reminded me had recently passed away, and the possibility of Theriaults offering the dolls for auction. So you can imagine it was an email that I quickly responded to, despite my birthday, and we started conversing, and I arranged to see him first week in January out in California, in their home in Northern California outside of San Francisco. So I went to the meeting, not knowing what to expect, not really understanding exactly the context of where this would end, but went in enthusiastically and ready to look at what I thought was the doll collection. And that's what I saw right away. In a strange sort of twist of fate, the boxes and crates were brought in of all of her dolls from her childhood youth, and they were unpacked and were spread out all over the house. So naturally, the family was thinking, we need to do something with these dolls first because they are literally unpacked and spread out everywhere before we can get to other things and other tasks in the process of working through her collections and her life, really. So we sat down and we talked about the dolls, and I still remember them. Charles, who's so gracious, and he told me, I want you to sit right here. That was my mom's favorite seat. You can sit there and tell us what you think. So we talked about the dolls and we talked about presenting these, and I was really excited. And I had done Jane Withers' personal childhood collection as well of dolls a few years before. And I saw the love and the passion and the energy and the excitement in the room for Jane Withers. Shirley Temple, not to put down Jane Withers, she was a wonderful friend of mine and a dear lady, but this is Shirley Temple. And so I talked to them about it, gave them the pitch on the dolls. We were going to do a special, unique event for these, everything, all set, everything is good to go. Until he said, that's great. How quick can you come and pack them? Because we've got to get to the rest of the things in the house from her childhood. And I said, like what? And he said, oh, well, we have almost every movie costume she ever wore. And I sat there just speechless, looking at him like, what? You have every movie costume? He said, yes, she saved everything. I said, I thought actors didn't get to keep their movie costumes. And he smiled and he looked at me and he said, well, Shirley Temple is not just any actor. So she got to take home all of her movie costumes, and they were lovingly preserved by her mother and then Shirley over all of these years. They were sitting right there in her closet. So he took me into the room just to show me, and he pulled out one dress, and it immediately triggered in me these incredible emotions, familiarity, a whole strong pull and tug of nostalgia in everything that I think of when I think of Shirley in the movies. It was the iconic red polka dot dress. And he's standing there holding it. And I'm looking right at it. And I never imagined in my years, in my career, that I would ever see this dress sitting in a closet, Shirley's closet, mind you, but there for me to witness firsthand. It was an incredible moment. And that, as I said, triggered something in me that was even beyond just the amazement. It triggered within me an idea. And we went back and we sat down in the living room. And I looked at Charles and his sister, Susan, and I told them, this is a far bigger story than just the dolls, just the costumes, just the memorabilia. This is an entire story that needs to be told of the most iconic childhood in history, that this is something that needs to be presented together. I realized at the time that I was taking the biggest gamble I've ever taken in my career in telling them that selling the dolls separate from the dresses, selling the memorabilia separate from the dolls, selling the dresses different from the memorabilia is a huge mistake, because everything together tells and paints a complete picture of this 10, 12-year period where Shirley was the number one box office star in the world year after year. and the amazing childhood she led during this time. And this is a story that needs to be told, and it can only be told completely. And so I told them, I'm putting my hat in for handling the collection in its entirety. And here's my pitch. And I totally went off the cuff, totally made it an instant enthusiasm and idea of how we would do it. I felt like there was something more to just an auction. And I've always believed this, that an auction is not just selling somebody's stuff. An auction is telling a story. And in the process, offering those stories to new collectors and new people who will preserve and take care of them for future generations. But what we're doing is completely telling the story to engage people in a way that is beyond just selling stuff. And what better example than Shirley Temple? I felt it deserved more than just an auction itself. It deserved a complete tour around America of bringing back people into the connection of Shirley and what she meant in so many people's lives in multiple generations, and to allow them a chance to see these pieces, see these dresses, see this memorabilia, see all the things that they remembered from her movies and her life, and to understand and connect with her in a more personal way than they had ever done through her movies or her music. So I proposed a tour to multiple cities prior to a large event that we would hold. I said, the best place, Middle America. We would hold a final event in Kansas City. Now, I can tell you, I love Kansas City. It's a beautiful city, but it's not exactly the entertainment memorabilia capital of America. So they looked at me at first and thought, Kansas City, interesting. And I said, well, Shirley Temple is America. She's not just California. She's not just New York. She's not just Florida. She is America in its entirety. She's small towns, big towns, every town. So why not do it right smack dab in the middle of America, and let's present it there. And they loved this idea. And so they said, we'll think about it. Those dreaded words. I had the deal for the dolls. I had it wrapped up, and I had to take it to another level. And I remember getting back into my rental car and driving away from the house that evening. And I called Florence, my mother, to talk to her about this and what I had done. And I said, I don't know if I just made the worst mistake of my career. And she said, posed the question to me that I still remember today that gave me the encouragement to accept my fate no matter what. She said, ask me, do you believe in what you presented? And I said, I absolutely believe in it. 100%. I know it's the right way to go. I know this is the right avenue for this collection, and it's the right way to present it to America, to the world. And she said, then you didn't make a mistake. No matter what happens, you did not make a mistake. Even if they go another route, you did the right thing. You encouraged the right process for this collection, and you should be proud of that. It was nice words at the time, but I was still left with that imminent doom of I had just blown a sure thing. But sure enough, about 10 days, 15 days, I don't remember exactly later, I remember being on vacation at the time with my family, and I was walking down a pathway of a hotel, and the phone rang, and I recognized the number, and I answered. And it was Charles Black, and he said, no one presented a vision like you did. No one saw through the idea of this being about America, all of America, every American, and the world. And to present the dolls and the memorabilia together like this as a complete story to be told. We're going to do it. We're going to go with you. And we're going to let you run with this whole idea. I was enthralled. I was so excited. I was poring immediately over every book I could, reading Shirley's memoirs, reading it all, learning online, everything about every intricacy of her life to make sure that I had the complete story, everything correct in association with all of these pieces. This began the journey. And then there was the packing, because we had to get it all out of the house, everything. 12 years of the most famous childhood in the world, where people just randomly sent her things from all over the world. My gosh, they sent her a cow once from Oregon. And she was screaming at her parents that, why can't we keep the cow? I mean, she had a lot of stuff. It was everywhere, and we had to sort through it. And what was interesting about the process of working on this collection, every piece had to be analyzed for the relevance to her childhood. What exactly did it mean? Who exactly gave it to her? Who was the person that gave it to her? Who was the person that created it? Why? And then looking as well for additional things that may correspond to that particular item. Keep in mind that in the 1930s, this was the most photographed personality in the world. There were thousands, I venture to say tens of thousands of photographs scattered all throughout the house and boxed and filed, organized, books of them everywhere. So we had to go through every item and look through all these photographs to try to correlate a photograph with that piece. Could it be a photograph of her holding one of the dolls? We would find many of them. Was it a photograph of her and Bilbo Jangles Robinson, the car, the famous miniature motor car that he gave her? All of these things had to be connected with the dots, you could say, I guess, of photographs and correlating background and stories that went with them. So this was a multi-week process working in the house in Woodside. And I remember a lot of sitting on the floor with piles of photos and going through them for hours and hours and hours. It was an amazing experience. And through this all, and this is an important thing, and I'll talk about it in a couple of different instances during the evolution of this whole Love Shirley Temple moment, the family was right there on the floor with me. It wasn't just, here's the keys, go pack the items. It was, they were meticulous in assuring and protecting the integrity of this and the history of every object and how it was presented, and to assure that everything had proper documentation and a proper storyline in which to do it. So they were every day with me, 8, 9, 10 hours a day, and our crew sitting there on the floor, working through photos, helping with all of the processes and putting the story together. So it was a group effort, family, Theriaults, me, everyone, and an incredible time of getting this. And then the truck is full and the truck rolls out. And here we go down the road, taking it back to Maryland, and then beginning the process of sorting through, setting up what would be the catalog of, I believe, around 600 pieces from her childhood that we would be offering, and then separating what would be on exhibit, that is traveling around the country for exhibit, and what would remain in the gallery and be transported eventually out just for the main auction. So, and doing all the photographs ahead of time, early, everything, all of that work done in the office leading up to the beginning of the exhibits. And it's about almost to this week right now, it's about 10 years exactly to when the truck rolled out to the first exhibit, which was in Rochester, New York, at the Margaret Woodbury Strong Museum of Play in Rochester, which I chose as kind of an interesting venue because of the connection to dolls they have, the relationship to childhood. And it seemed like a really good place to begin on the East Coast and begin to work gradually to the West, to California, and return back to Kansas City. So there we were, going up to Rochester and setting up this whole exhibit. We typically would bring about 200 pieces, ranging from dresses to dolls to memorabilia items to Bilbo Jangles' car that he gave her. Everything traveled with this and were set up and on display in the museum and open to the general public free of charge, typically for a 4, 5, 6 day period. And then myself and number of our crew and museum staff all positioned and stationed there throughout each day, every moment, helping people, doing docent tours of the exhibit, talking about the different items and the relevance to her life in the movies. So it was another opportunity. And this was the real moment, because this is when I got to connect to the emotions that people felt for these items in a very personal way. I remember in Rochester, I was standing there with the doors open the first morning, and I didn't know what to expect. would people still feel this emotion for Shirley all these years later? Would there still be that visceral attachment to her childhood and her life? Oh, yes, there certainly was. The doors opened and a throng of people that had been lined up for a couple of hours waiting outside came running to the exhibit, including my favorite, two 90-year-old twin sisters who grew up together watching Shirley, singing the songs, doing the dances, call it the TikTok of the 1930s, was Shirley. And they knew and remembered every word of every song, and they remembered every dance move from everything Shirley ever did. And all of a sudden, the two of them were standing there, and they burst out in tears together. And they were holding each other as they looked at the Good Ship lollipop dress. And there was just this flood of emotions. And I started crying. And everybody started crying all around. And then all of a sudden, they stopped. And they looked at each other. And there was this little smile. And I'm getting choked up even thinking about it. A little smile on both of their faces. And they started dancing. And they started singing on the Good Ship lollipop. And they did it all the way through from top to bottom and danced every dance step all the way through as well, together in unison, 90-year-old twin sisters. And that was the moment I said, wow, this is a train I'm on. This is going to be one heck of a ride. This is going to be so many flooding emotions throughout everywhere we go. And I knew we were on to something. And it was indeed. We were bringing Shirley back to America. One more farewell tour. One way for her to say thank you and to share her life with you a little bit more intimately. And seeing those 90-year-old twin sisters dancing away, I knew the specialness of what we were embarking on. And I knew as well how important this was to many people. But I noticed something else in that first exhibit that was really interesting, was that it wasn't just 90-year-old women who grew up with Shirley. It was multi-generational. There were sometimes 3 generations, grandmother, mother, and daughter, all coming to the exhibit and sharing their own stories and their own relationship with Shirley. The mother grew up with Shirley and going to see them in the cinemas. The daughter grew up with watching them on TV, the reruns of all the old Shirley movies on TV. And the granddaughter grew up watching DVDs of Shirley's movie because grandma loved them and wanted her to see how unique of an actress and a personality she was, and got hooked on Shirley Temple. It wasn't just that generation. It's carried on and it's aged well, and it still holds an important message of positivity. And that was what I saw as we went from place to place. Was you would have 24-year-olds and 94-year-olds all engaging and loving and laughing and enjoying every moment of seeing these exhibits. We went on to Boston, to Morristown, New Jersey, to the Morris Museum, and that's where I first met Melissa Tonneson. And one of the most unique characters throughout my experiences with Shirley and this year that we had, she was definitely one of the standouts of the most passionate I ever saw. Another one who walked into the exhibit, saw the dresses, and immediately burst out in tears. She had grown up loving Shirley. She became a school teacher, used Shirley in her lessons and inspired by Shirley's music and dance and movies, and was a passionate collector and researcher as well of Shirley's life. Believe me, when I would give tours and I would make a mistake anywhere in the exhibit, she would quickly correct me. Now, Stuart, actually, that was not exactly the scene in the movie where this dress appeared in. And so I realized if Melissa's there, I better be really accurate with everything. So she helped me a lot, really kind of zoom in on some of the areas I was a little loose on and gave me some really good behind the scenes factual information to even polish my docent efforts even more with the exhibits. But she's incredible. And she's a New Jersey collector, and she started bringing friends, and she had friends there as well that would come. And I started to call them, and because she was connected to a number of other Shirley collectors around the country. And she would call them and tell them, encourage them to come to the next city exhibit. And everybody was talking about Melissa, and everybody knows Melissa. And then I realized that she had this little like core following of people. And so I started calling them Shirley's Army, because they really were like the defenders of Shirley's legacy and the defenders of her history. And they were really wanting to make sure that people respected and understood what she meant to this country and to our history and to Hollywood to an extent and to people's emotions. So she loved that name. And I said, why don't you make a group? You should make some fun group of online and call it Shirley's Army. And she thought, and she liked it. And I said, Facebook is the place to do it. Make a group on Facebook called Shirley's Army. And she said, okay, maybe I'll give it a try. So I don't think at the time Melissa was entirely comfortable with Facebook, but she had her daughter help her and set up a whole Facebook page, and it exploded. It took off. And she has now, I think, 1,500 members, if not more, and still daily posting stories, photographs, news about Shirley that still comes up, anything, memories, but mostly community and friends of shared values of people who love Shirley Temple, all coming together and talking and making a family. They are indeed Shirley's Army, and they are fantastic. If you're wanting to join a great Facebook group, and I will tell you, it's not all 100% 24/7, every moment Shirley Temple. It branches out a little bit, and it discusses some of the other child actors and actresses of that time. You'll see some Jane Withers things thrown in there and other ones. So it's a whole conversation about sort of the period and the connection to Shirley. Call it 6 Degrees of Shirley Temple. They'll even analyze Shirley Temple beverages around the country. So it's a great group. You should get in there. And it was one of the products of this whole thing. So look how this one event, this one moment in time began to spawn all of these other communities and relationships and friendships. That is right there, the essence of the joy of collecting and how it can bring people together in such beautiful ways, in such a positive way. So the exhibits continued on, and eventually we started moving out west. And in California was, of course, the place where, wow, the exhibits exploded. I mean, it was over the top. Palo Alto, California. It was just a couple miles down the road from where Shirley lived most of her adult life, privately in Northern California with her husband, Charles. And so she was very connected to that community. Many people knew her, saw her in the grocery store, saw her in restaurants, and loved her. And she was a passionate member of that community. So when we brought that exhibit to Palo Alto, to an old historic movie theater that is still on the main street and still shows classic movies of the 30s, 40s, 50s, we set up an exhibit there in their gallery space. The lines that formed became, I hate to say it, almost out of control, to the point that Palo Alto police had to be stationed outside down the streets for the crowd control, because at one point we had, I think, 4 or 5 blocks, a line going with probably a 3 to 4 hour wait to get into the museum or to the gallery and the exhibit. So imagine that. Oh, to top it all off, one of the worst heat waves of June to ever hit Northern California struck that week. So every day was like 95 degrees, almost 100 degrees in Palo Alto. I had 90-year-old women standing outside for 3 to 4 hours at times, waiting, and they were not going to leave. They were not giving up. They were going to see and say goodbye to Shirley and pay their respects to her and see these beautiful objects in real life for themselves once. And they did it. They stood there for hours at times. There were some that I thought were not looking well. So I would pull them out to the front and help them get in early because we don't need people passing out waiting for Shirley. And I don't think Shirley would have appreciated that as well. We had to entertain people. And we're trying desperately to keep people in line and keep them patient and telling them it's worthwhile. You're going to love this. And so there was a bit of a crowd control element. And that became in itself kind of fun. And people, it was Shirley. So people were really nice. They weren't impatient. They were overly patient. In fact, they turned it all into a big street party. We had at times everybody down a line of 30 people. I would start it off and say, let's do it. Everybody, let's sing Good Ship Lollipop. I will tell you, during these exhibits, I sang Good Ship Lollipop more than any song in my entire life. I know it entirely. No, I'm not going to sing it here today because when we did that auction and I sold that last lot, I vowed to the world I'm never singing that song again. I love it, but I'm done. My career is over singing Good Ship Lollipop. So we would sing that song and I would get entire lines of hundreds of people singing Good Ship Lollipop on the streets of Palo Alto. I mean, people across the street were like, who are these people? Not knowing what this exhibit was. So it was quite a fun time. Well, apparently a local news station went down and did a small little news blip about the massive crowd showing up for Shirley's exhibit in Palo Alto. And they broadcast it on the TV, and Charles and Susan happened to be watching and seeing this on TV and realized, oh my gosh, look at this line of people out there, and had a moment of thinking, you know what? We need to go help, and we need to go work this crowd and walk down there and shake hands. And they did. Isn't that amazing? This is, again, another part of that family and who Shirley raised, the values they have, in that they drove down and they didn't have to stand out there in 95-degree heat. They didn't have to entertain people. That was my job. But they did it just for the sheer joy of being able to see the smiles on people's faces when they would walk down and shake hands. And people were like, you're Shirley Temple's family. I can't believe this. And they would do it. They would walk down the line and say hi and hug and shake hands with people. They were incredible. And they gave another whole dynamic to that one particular exhibit that was absolutely fantastic. The one exhibit, too, that I would say really did exude a ton of emotions was Santa Monica. And obviously, it's where Shirley was born, where she started her career. Her house that she first grew up in still stands in Santa Monica today. And I think the people who own it are probably sick and tired of everybody driving by and looking at it. But there it is. They bought Shirley Temple's house. You got to expect it. This exhibit at the Santa Monica History Museum was unbelievable. It was a small space, but we managed to get everything into this museum. And they emptied the entire museum to bring in this exhibit because this was their native daughter. This was Shirley, who grew up in Santa Monica, who was discovered outside in Santa Monica in a theater. And it was a coming home in a way. And again, another whole set of incredible emotions behind this. So we, again, lines out the door, and the family all came for this particular one as well, because there were a number of celebrity events that were scheduled to correspond to the exhibit, including an evening red carpet affair, which I had never been to a Hollywood red carpet event before, so I didn't know what to expect. But I decided to invite my old friend, Jane Withers, as my date for the evening for this red carpet event at the museum. So I sent a car to pick up Jane, and she arrived, and she was dressed beautifully. And this was a few years before she passed away. So I'm so glad that she was able to experience this. And we walked down the red carpet together, and we had the photographs all taken of she and I, where they were like, Jane, Jane, taking photographs and then saying, who's that guy with her? So my famous moment of the red carpet in Hollywood. Anyway, so I brought Jane into the exhibit, and this was a private moment for all the people invited for this reception. And we had a number of child actors and actresses there through the years. Margaret O'Brien was there. We were all talking. Jerry Mathers, Beaver, He was there. He was fun. He was great. And then one really random thing, I don't know, one of the big stars from Battlestar Galactica, which I don't know why, but he was there. And my brother Luke was just like horrified. He was like, oh my gosh, he's an idol. I love him. I can't believe you got to meet him. So I've never watched Battlestar Galactica, so I can't tell you who it was or anything about it. But he was impressed. But anyway, Jane, I took her around as my date, and we walked around and looked at all the pieces. And then the moment came, and I call it the moment with Jane. I'd worked with Jane for years, including spending a couple weeks working in her warehouses she had in Van Nuys that housed all of her entertainment collection, pulling out all the dolls of her childhood for the auction we would do for her some years before. So Jane and I knew each other a long time. And I was walking down, and then she stopped, and she's just, she was frozen. And she looked across the room. And at this point, Jane was pretty much using a walker or a wheelchair. She ran. She absolutely ran because she saw Pinky. Now, if you don't know who Pinky is, you can Google Pinky, Shirley Temple's doll, and you'll probably see the auction catalog, because the auction catalog is still online for you all to look at. And you can see it was a Lenchi doll produced in the 1920s, 30s, and used in the classic movie Bright Eyes, of course, which had Jane Withers playing the wealthy child of the neighborhood and Shirley Temple playing the poor child. And so Shirley had just a broken little composition doll that she would push around in the stroller. And the character Jane Withers played was the snooty, wealthy young girl who had the beautiful, crisp, pink Italian art doll that she had in her carriage. And so the story is that when the movie ended and the filming ended for the movie, Shirley was given Jane Withers' doll. Well, Jane never got over it. And she always considered that it was her doll. She had it in the movie, but they gave it to Shirley. I'm not going to get involved in the drama of this, all right? But it was such a magical moment when Jane saw Pinky again. She hadn't held it since she had been that child filming in that movie and loved that doll. So we walked up to it, and she started crying, and she looked at me and she said, "Can I hold her one more time?" Now, clearly we were not allowing people to touch things or hold things or anything along those lines, but come on, this is a magical moment. This is Jane being reunited with Pinky. So I took the doll out carefully, and she sat down in her wheelchair, and she held that doll, and held it with passion and held it like the love of a young child would, taking us back all those years to that moment in Bright Eyes. And she looked up at me and she said, "You know, this is my doll." And I'm like, "Jane," she said, but I love her so much. And I'm like, "I know, Jane, but I'm so glad you've had this moment and this chance to hold her one more time and to reunite with her for a moment." And then I had to gently kind of pull the doll out of her hands and put it back on exhibit. But it was a beautiful moment, a bittersweet moment, a happy moment, a sad moment, all of it all together. And I'll never forget it. And Jane was a champion through that whole evening, talking to people. And even she would jump out of her wheelchair and start doing a little dance on her own as well at that time. She was unbelievable. I was so happy to share that evening. And it was a special time as well in all of these childhood celebrities and people who were involved in Hollywood in the 1930s and 40s that came through and came by to greet and see this exhibit and these pieces. And then the people came for days and the lines again, and all of it was just fantastic. And we finished off the last exhibit of all places. We had to head back to the Midwest, and we had one museum in Louisville, Kentucky, and that wanted to host the final one. And we did, because there was a magical connection of Kentucky and Shirley Temple, and that was the Little Colonel. And so we brought, of course, all the dresses from the Little Colonel, specially for this exhibit, to bring them into Kentucky to allow people in Kentucky to see these costumes that kind of made Kentucky famous during that period in that movie. And so another great event that was held, that a ton of incredible emotions. And I know that a few of the dresses, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that were from a Little Colonel ended up going to Kentucky collectors who came to that exhibit. So fantastic run that lasted, I'm trying to think, from April until early July, or just before the auction, which was in mid-July in Kansas City. So they were running nonstop. We'd literally be there for a week. We'd pack it all up. The truck would move to the next one. We would all fly there, wait for the truck to arrive, unpack it, reset it back up, and go. And then just hosting people, dancing, singing, laughing, connecting with people, and listening to their stories and what Shirley meant to them. And there were endless stories. The stories from the 90-year-old women who grew up as young children, sneaking into the movie theater because they had no money to see Shirley's new release, and how they had no dolls. They had very little growing in the Depression years, and yet Shirley gave them hope and saved their childhood in many ways. And people would tell me this over and over and over again. And wow, I still tear up today thinking of all those stories. That trip, those exhibits, that was the train I was on. And I always say, Shirley put me on that train. She took me on a ride with her through America that I will never forget. That will end part one of Love Shirley Temple 10 years later. In part two next week, in the next episode, I'll share with you the auction, one of the most incredible moments in auction history across the world, and certainly the most incredible moment in my career ever with an auction. Different than I normally do, but truly an impactful, powerful, wild 14 hours on the podium or something along those lines. I don't even remember. Maybe I'm exaggerating. I often do, but it was up there. Longest time on the podium I've ever had as an auctioneer. And I'll share with you as well some of the takeaways over this past 10 years, what we've seen evolve, develop, the friendships made, the people I've come to know, and the reemergence of some of the pieces from that collection that have been reoffered again to new collectors, and a few stories behind those. So come on by next week and let's share part two of Love Shirley Temple 10 years later.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Curious Collector. The Curious Collector is hosted by Stuart Holbrook and produced by Tammy Trujillo. We invite you to follow us on social media, and feel free to leave any questions you have for Stuart on Facebook at Stuart Holbrook-Theriaults, or follow the Theriault Company Facebook page. And you can stay up to date with the latest auctions and events at Theriaults.com. We'll talk to you on the next episode of The Curious Collector.